She had $43 and a rusted key. The family had just finished laughing. A woman alone. A building everyone agreed was worthless. 200 acres of Virginia hill country that nobody wanted until they did. Until someone ran the numbers on what was underneath and decided an old woman with frozen accounts and a granddaughter with nothing was the easiest problem to solve. They were wrong about the accounts, wrong about the granddaughter, wrong about the building, and wrong most fatally about how long a woman who had been watching for 6 years could hold. The key turned, the door opened, and what she found inside wasn't ruin. It was everything. The morning of Eleanor Ashford's funeral, Claire had $43 in her checking account, a trunk full of draft equipment, and absolutely nowhere else to be. She'd known that for 6 weeks. She just hadn't said it out loud until now. The drive from her sublet in Charlottesville took 2 hours. 2 hours of November highway, bare trees, the kind of gray sky that doesn't commit to rain but won't give you sun either. Claire kept the radio off. She needed to think. Or maybe she needed to stop thinking. She hadn't decided which. Eleanor Ashford, 79 years old, built a real estate portfolio in Richmond that the family had been quietly circling for the better part of a decade. Sharp until the end. The obituary said beloved matriarch. Claire had read that word and sat with it for a long moment. Beloved by whom exactly? She pulled into the service lane behind the funeral home at 11:47. Sat in the car for 3 minutes. Watched a groundskeeper rake leaves into a pile, lose half of them to the wind, and start over without any visible frustration. Claire got out of the car. The Ashford family gathered in the main parlor of the Whitmore Funeral Home on Grace Street, and if you didn't know them, you might have mistaken it for a board meeting. Everyone was dressed correctly. Everyone was speaking at the right volume. Victor Langley stood near the fireplace with a glass of water he hadn't touched, nodding at something his attorney was saying. He was 54, her mother's brother, and he had the stillness of a man who had already run the numbers and liked what he found. Claire spotted him before he spotted her. She had 3 seconds of advantage. She used them to collect herself, straighten her jacket, and decide she would not let him see anything on her face that he could use later. He turned and saw her and smiled. Claire. He crossed the room without hurrying. That was Victor's thing. He never hurried. It was a power move so practiced it had become genuine. You made it. She was my grandmother. Of course. He put a hand on her shoulder. Briefly. The way you'd touch someone you were managing. How are you holding up? Fine, good, that's good. He looked at her the way people look at things they've already decided aren't worth much. Quickly. Thoroughly. Then away. There are sandwiches in the back room if you haven't eaten. She hadn't. She didn't go get one. The service was what it was. A minister who had met Eleanor twice, read passages she would have considered sentimental. A cousin from Roanoke gave a short remembrance that was technically accurate and emotionally hollow. Claire sat in the 3rd row and looked at the casket and thought about the last time she'd seen her grandmother alive, 4 months ago. A Sunday afternoon. Eleanor had called, which was unusual. She preferred to communicate through Pemberton Slade, her public notary and all-purpose keeper of things. But she'd called herself, and she'd asked Claire how the Mercer building assessment had gone, and she'd listened to the whole answer, which almost no one did. Then she'd said, "You see things in the right order. Most people see what they want first. You see what's there." Claire had thought that was a compliment. She still thought that. She just wished she'd said something back that was worth saying. The reception afterward was held at the Ashford House on Monument Avenue. High ceilings, original plaster medallions, furniture that cost more than Claire's car. She moved through it with a glass of white wine she was rationing. Diana Langley, Victor's wife, Diana, who wore grief like an accessory, was holding court near the bay window, and the attorney Pemberton had mentioned was parked by the bookshelf looking at nothing. Claire found a spot near the hallway where she could see the room without being in it. This was her skill. Not just in buildings. In rooms full of people, too. She could read a space. She could tell you where the load was being carried and where the surface was decorative, and where the two had stopped matching up. Victor was carrying the load today. Diana was decorative. And the attorney by the bookshelf, Pemberton Slade, 71, white-haired, shoes that needed resoling, was watching all of it with the patience of a man who had already seen how this ended. She caught his eye once. He nodded, just barely. Claire looked away first. The reading of the will took place at 2 in the afternoon in Eleanor's study. Pemberton read it. His voice was even and unhurried, and he didn't editorialize, and Claire respected that. Victor received the commercial portfolio, 11 properties, primarily office and retail, valued collectively at something in the neighborhood of $4 million. Diana received the investment accounts. 2 cousins received specified amounts. The household staff received bequests that were, Claire noted, genuinely generous. And then Pemberton looked up from the document and found her. To my granddaughter, Claire Ann Ashford, he read, I bequeath the Crofton property, consisting of the main structure and surrounding 200 acres in Crofton County, Virginia, along with a maintenance stipend of $1,800 per month for a period of 12 months. Silence. The kind of silence a room makes when everyone has the same thought at the same time and none of them say it. Then someone coughed, badly disguised, and Diana made a sound in her throat that was too quiet to call a laugh, but definitely wasn't a cough. Victor said nothing. He was looking at the middle distance with an expression that told Claire he wasn't surprised. That bothered her more than the laugh. She kept her face neutral. She had learned that from Eleanor, actually. Don't show the room what you're thinking. Not because you're hiding it, because it's yours. After Pemberton finished and the room began to disperse into smaller conversations, the kind where people are carefully not looking at each other, Victor found her again. The Crofton property. He said it like a diagnosis. She always had a soft spot for that place. Apparently, it's been empty for years, Claire. The roof has issues. There's no reliable utilities. I'll figure out. He looked at her with something that was almost pity. Almost. You know, if you wanted to, we could, the family could. I mean, if you needed to liquidate quickly, we could facilitate that without making it a whole production. Keep it clean. That's generous of you. Just practical. I'll keep that in mind. She smiled the way Eleanor had smiled at people offering her advice she hadn't asked for, pleasantly, completely closed. Victor nodded and walked away, and she watched him go and thought, he already has a buyer. He already has a buyer. And the ink isn't dry yet. Pemberton found her 20 minutes later, when the room had thinned enough to breathe. He touched her elbow and tilted his head toward the hallway without speaking. She followed. The room he led her to was Eleanor's private study, smaller than the main office. Walls of books that had actually been read. A desk with a green lamp that was still on for some reason, and it made the whole room feel like someone had just stepped out rather than died. He closed the door. He set his briefcase on the desk, opened it, and removed a second document. This one was in a plain envelope, unsealed, her name written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. Angular. Precise, not elegant, purposeful. There is an addendum, Pemberton said. It was not read in the main session at your grandmother's specific instruction. Claire looked at the envelope. What does it say? I'll let you read it, but I'll summarize the operative clause. He folded his hands. If you sell, transfer, or encumber any portion of the Crofton property within 24 months of taking possession, ownership reverts automatically and entirely to the Blue Ridge Land Conservancy. She waited. Not to Victor, Pemberton said, reading her face. Not to the estate, not to any family member. To the Conservancy, irrevocably. Claire sat down in the chair across from the desk. It was Eleanor's reading chair, good leather, worn in the right places. She sat in it and looked at the envelope in her hands. She didn't trust me, Claire said. She trusted you more than she trusted anyone. Pemberton's voice didn't change, but something in it did. She wanted you to have time to understand what you were holding before you decided what to do with it. Those are different things. What if I can't afford to hold it for 24 months? Then you'll find a way, or you won't, and it goes to the Conservancy, and she considered that an acceptable outcome. He picked up the briefcase. She left you the stipend for the same reason people leave tools, not money. It's enough to work with, not enough to coast on. Claire looked at the green lamp, still burning. She took the envelope with her when she left. She drove to Crofton the next morning, not because she'd decided anything, because she needed to see it. And because her sublet lease ended in 6 weeks, and because there are moments when the only honest thing you can do is go toward the thing that scares you and get a better look. The drive from Richmond to Crofton County was 1 hour and 40 minutes on a clear day. It was not a clear day. November had settled in overnight, that early November cold, not bitter yet, but making promises. And the highway gave way to state routes and then to county roads, and the trees on both sides got closer, and the sky got smaller. And somewhere around the third unmarked turn, Claire realized she was using the hand-drawn map Eleanor had included in the envelope. She hadn't planned to use it. She'd brought up the GPS on her phone, watched it load, started driving. But the signal had dropped somewhere past the second turn, and she'd picked up the map instead, and now she was using it, and she was noticing something. The scale was accurate, not approximately precisely. The distances between the landmark notations matched the odometer to within 1/10 of a mile. The elevation changes were marked with contour indicators she recognized from survey documents. Whoever drew this wasn't approximating. They were surveying. Eleanor, of course. Claire had assumed the map was sentimental, a grandmother's directions. She corrected that assumption now. It was a technical document dressed in pencil. She took the fourth left past the split-rail fence section as indicated, and found a gravel road she would have missed entirely if she'd been looking at a phone screen. Low branches scraped the roof of the car. The road curved twice, uphill, and then the trees opened and she was in a clearing. She stopped the car and looked at it. The Crofton property. 200 acres. Her inheritance. The structure itself sat at the east edge of the clearing, backed against the tree line. It was smaller than she'd imagined, which she realized was because she'd been imagining it wrong. She'd been trying to picture something that justified the family's mockery, which meant she'd been picturing a ruin. This wasn't a ruin. It was just modest. A single-story structure with a covered porch on the south-facing side, a stone chimney at the east end, wood siding that had gone gray over the years. The porch railing needed work. The south window had a crack in the corner glass. The foundation plantings were overgrown, but the roofline was level. That was the first thing she noticed as a professional. The roofline was true. No sag, no drift, no evidence of structural settling, and the chimney was straight. And the porch posts, though weathered, were plumb. She could see it from here, from the car, without a level. She got out. The air was cold and smelled like damp leaves and something faintly mineral groundwater nearby probably. Her boots on the gravel were the only sound. She walked toward the structure slowly, the way she always approached a building she was reading for the first time. She stopped at the porch steps, looked up. The board at the top step had a slight spring to it. She could see the gap where the nail had worked loose. She noted it and stepped around it. She knocked on the front door, not because she expected anyone, just because she always did. It felt like the right thing. You knocked before you entered a space. You asked permission, even of empty rooms. She turned the key and opened the door. The smell hit first. Cedar and something mineral like old stone, and very faintly linseed oil, the kind used to treat unfinished wood. Not new, not stale, somewhere in between, like a room that had been aired out recently. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let her eyes adjust. Then she started reading the room. The interior was one large open space living area and kitchen, without a wall between them. A hallway to the right that presumably led to the bedroom. The floors were wide plank wood, dark with age and treatment. The walls were tongue and groove pine, finished but not painted. The ceiling was exposed beam, and the beams where she looked closer white oak. Not decorative. Structural and old and in excellent condition. She crossed to the nearest wall and knocked on it. Solid, not hollow. She knocked on the wall perpendicular to it. Different. Slightly. Not hollow exactly, but different in a way that meant the material behind it wasn't the same. She knocked on both walls again, slowly, moving along their length. The difference was consistent. The exterior wall had something behind it, insulation probably, but denser than standard fiberglass. The interior wall was original construction. She crouched and pressed her palm flat on the floor. Concrete below the subfloor. She was sure of it. The give was wrong for wood on earth, too even, too solid. The sound of her knuckles on the boards too short. Someone had poured a slab under this structure and then finished over it. She stood up and looked around the room again. Slowly this time. Starting at the ceiling and working down. The beams were original. The floor was refinished but original boards. The kitchen area had been updated. She could see it in the cabinet hardware. The configuration of the countertop. The way the sink sat, but the bones beneath the update were old. Everything that was old was in good condition. Everything that had been replaced correctly. This was not a derelict cabin. This was a building that had been maintained and selectively upgraded by someone who knew what they were doing. She walked to the bedroom. Same floor material. Window facing east toward the tree line. A closet that had been built out. She could see the framing was newer than the surrounding walls, maybe 15 years old, done carefully. A second door in the north wall that she almost missed because it was flush-mounted and painted the same color as the wall. She tried the handle. Locked. She noted it. She went back to the main room, to the small built-in desk in the corner near the kitchen. 3 drawers. The top 2 held nothing of note: a box of matches, a flashlight, a few old utility bills addressed to Ashford Land Trust that she set aside. The bottom drawer was deeper than it looked. She pulled it all the way out. Under a folder of what appeared to be old property tax documents, there was an envelope, thick, unsealed. Her name on the outside in Eleanor's handwriting, the same angular script from the other envelope, the same purposeful slant. Inside was a single folded page, and behind that something heavier. She unfolded the page first. Eleanor's handwriting, dated March of this year, 8 months before she died. Claire, the drawings are in the back of this envelope. I found them in 2019 when you submitted them to the Mercer Group for the warehouse conversion they ultimately didn't fund. The project died. You moved on. I kept them because I wanted to understand how you thought about a space. I hired a contractor in 2020 and we rebuilt the interior according to your specifications. Not everything, the scale was different. I had to adapt, but the structural logic is yours. The slab, the insulation system, the way the beams were refastened. That was your thinking, not mine. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to see it yourself first. Claire read it twice. Then she turned the envelope over and shook out the contents. Drawings. Her drawings. She recognized the line work immediately, the way she did her hatching. The particular shorthand she used for structural notes in the margins. The title block format she'd been using since graduate school. These were hers. They were from the Mercer Group project. The warehouse conversion pitch she'd spent 3 weeks on in 2019 for a client who'd pulled funding and never explained why. She'd thought they were gone. The project had died so thoroughly that she'd never even asked for her documents back. Eleanor had them. Had them for 4 years. Had hired a contractor and rebuilt this structure: the slab, the insulation, the beam refastening according to Claire's design logic, adapted for a different scale and purpose. The room she was standing in, the solid floor under her boots, the dense resistance in the exterior walls, the true beam lines overhead. That was her work. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. It was too large and too specific, and she hadn't been prepared for it. She folded the drawings carefully, put them back in the envelope, set it on the desk. She walked back to the center of the room and stood there for a moment. Eleanor had never told her. Never mentioned the project, never mentioned the contractor, never said anything in 4 years of occasional phone calls, and 2 holiday visits and 1 Sunday afternoon conversation about the Mercer building. She had just done it, quietly, without asking for credit or offering explanation. Claire looked at the ceiling, the white oak beams cleaned and treated and bearing the load they were designed to bear. She thought about what Eleanor had said on that Sunday phone call. You see things in the right order. Most people see what they want first. You see what's there. She had thought that was a compliment about her professional eye. Maybe it was. Maybe it was also Eleanor explaining why she'd made the choice she'd made. Why she'd kept the drawings. Why she'd built the thing and left it for Claire to find. She pressed her palm against the nearest wall. The wood was cool and slightly rough under her hand, and very solid. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the sound of it came through the walls, clearly not drafts. Just sound, the way a well-sealed building lets you hear the world without letting it in. She needed to measure this room. She went back to the car and got her tape measure. She was in there for the better part of 3 hours, measuring everything, writing it down in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. Room dimensions, ceiling height, window placement and rough opening sizes, door widths, the dimensions of the locked north door in the bedroom, the footprint of the kitchen update versus the original wall lines she could read in the ceiling above. And then she found the discrepancy. She'd measured the exterior first, walking the perimeter with the tape measure extended, noting the overall footprint. Then she'd measured the interior rooms in sequence and added them together. The interior was 11 feet deeper on the north side than the exterior dimensions accounted for. She stood in the bedroom and looked at the north wall. Flush-mounted door, painted to match, locked, 11 feet, not an error. She'd measured twice. 11 feet of space between the north interior wall and the north exterior wall. Too large for an insulation cavity. Too deep for a mechanical chase. Too intentional to be a mistake. She tried the door again. Still locked. She went through every key on the ring Pemberton had given her. 3 keys: the front door, the back door, and one she hadn't placed yet. She tried the unplaced key in the north door. It opened. The room on the other side was exactly 11 feet deep and ran the full width of the structure's north end. No windows. A single pull-chain bulb in the ceiling. She pulled it, and the bulb came on, which meant there was electricity running to this room, which meant it was connected to the main panel. Filing cabinets along 2 walls, 4 of them, full height. A folding work table in the center. On the table, a cardboard box with her name on it in Eleanor's handwriting, and beside it an accordion folder labeled in the same hand, Crofton Operational. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment. 11 feet of hidden room, filing cabinets. A box with her name on it. She pulled the chain bulb and let the light fill it. She crossed to the folding table and opened the accordion folder first. Inside, property tax records going back to 1998, organized by year. Maintenance logs with contractor names and dates and scope of work. The original deed registered to Ashford Land Trust, with a registration date in 1998, and a chain of title that went back further than she'd expected. Insurance documents. Utility account records. A separate section of tabbed documents labeled Legal Land Trust that she didn't open yet. Then she opened the box. Inside, on top of everything, was an envelope. Her name, Eleanor's handwriting. No date. Under the envelope, 4 more project folders, each labeled with a year. 2015, 2017, 2021. She set those aside and opened the envelope. 1 page, Eleanor's hand. By the time you find this room, you will have already understood several things. The building. The drawings. The way this place has been maintained. I want to be specific about one thing, which is this: I did not leave you this property because you are my granddaughter. I left it to you because you are the only person in my family who will read the room correctly, not because you have sentiment for it, because you have the skill to see what it actually is. The folders in the box are the beginning of that reading. Take your time. There is no deadline except the one in the addendum, which is not a deadline but a filter. I needed to know you would stay long enough to understand. E.A. Claire set the letter down. She looked at the filing cabinets, at the 4 labeled folders in the box, at the accordion file of operational records. Outside, the light was already going. November in the Blue Ridge, the sun dropped early and without ceremony. She pulled the chain on the bulb. She went back to the main room and turned on the kitchen light, which worked. She found the thermostat on the west wall and turned the heat on. She heard it kick on somewhere under the floor, a heat pump, she guessed, buried in the slab. She hadn't found the mechanical access, but she would. She went back to her car, got her bag, and brought it inside. She set it on the kitchen table. She went back to the hidden room and took the 4 labeled folders to the kitchen table and opened the first one, 2015. Inside, a bank statement, a wire transfer record, and 2 pages of handwritten notes in Eleanor's careful script. The wire transfer was from an account labeled Langley LLC to an account labeled VTL Holdings. The amount was $41,000. The notation field on the wire read Management Fee Q3. There was no property listed. No service described, no contract attached. There was a handwritten note clipped to the front, not a management fee. No management services rendered in Q3 2015. Compare to trust disbursement schedule, same period. Claire looked at that for a long time. Then she opened the 2017 folder. Same structure. More transfers, larger amounts, more notes in Eleanor's handwriting, each one precise and without editorializing. Just the number, the date, the notation from the sending account, and then Eleanor's observation about what that notation did or did not correspond to in the actual financial record. It was not a journal. It was not a letter. It was documentation. Eleanor had been building a file for years, quietly, in the same way she'd built this room, without announcing it, without confronting anyone, just watching and recording and waiting. Claire closed the folders and sat at the kitchen table in the small, solid, correctly constructed building that her grandmother had built using her drawings without telling her. The heat was working. The room was warming. Through the east window she could see the last of the light going in the trees. She thought about Victor at the reception, looking at her with that quick, thorough assessment, already knowing she'd gotten the Crofton property, already not worried about it, because he thought it was worthless. She thought about the discrepancy in the measurements. 11 feet, the locked door, the filing cabinets. She thought about the folder labeled 2015, not a management fee, no management services rendered. She looked at the kitchen, at the correctly done cabinet work and the level countertop, and the hardware that was functional rather than decorative. This room was built by someone who understood that what mattered was what held. She picked up her notebook and wrote at the top of a new page, "What does Victor know that he thinks I don't?" Then she uncapped her pen and started listing. She spent the first night on the couch with her jacket pulled over her like a blanket and the 2015 folder open on the coffee table in front of her. Not reading, just looking at it. There was a difference. Reading meant she was processing. Looking meant she was still deciding whether she wanted to know. She decided around 2 in the morning, picked it up. Read it properly this time, all the way through, every page, every note Eleanor had clipped to every document. Then she read the 2017 folder. Then 2018. She left the 2021 folder closed, not because she wasn't ready, because she wanted to sleep first and come at it with a clear head. She didn't really sleep, but she tried. By 7 in the morning she was outside with instant coffee she'd made, with the kettle she found under the kitchen sink, standing on the south-facing porch, watching the light come through the trees. The Blue Ridge in November. Everything bare, everything visible. The tree line was 120 feet from the porch, and she could see deep into it now that the leaves were gone. Could see the land slope downward to the north and level out somewhere she couldn't quite track from here. 200 acres. She didn't know what 200 acres looked like from the ground. She was used to urban assessments. Footprints measured in square feet, not acres. Structures on lots, lots on blocks. This was different. This was open in a way she hadn't expected to feel. Not peaceful, just large. She heard the truck before she saw it. Old engine, gravel under tires, the particular sound of a vehicle that knows the road it's on. It came up the access lane and stopped at the edge of the clearing, and a woman got out. 64 maybe. A little older. Brown field coat, work boots that had seen actual work, gray hair cut short and practical. She was carrying a paper bag in one hand and a thermos in the other, and she walked toward the porch with the ease of someone who had done this before. "You're Claire," the woman said, not a question. "Yes, Agatha Wren." She held up the paper bag. "Brought food. The nearest grocery is 22 minutes. I figured you hadn't gone yet." Claire looked at her. "How did you know I was here?" "Because Eleanor said you'd come within 48 hours of the reading." Agatha set the bag on the porch rail and unscrewed the thermos cap. She was right about most things. Coffee's real, by the way. That instant from the cabinet under the sink is terrible. Claire looked down at her mug, then back at Agatha. "Who are you?" Claire said. Actually, Agatha poured 2 cups from the thermos and handed one over without being asked. "Neighbor. 3 miles northeast, retired county employee." She picked up her own cup and the person your grandmother paid to keep an eye on this property. There it was. "How long?" Claire said. "Since 2017. "Doing what exactly?" Agatha looked at her levelly. "Not watching the land." Watching who was watching the land? Eleanor found the first transfers in early 2017. She knew Victor would eventually look at the land once he needed somewhere to put the money. She wanted to know when he started looking. Claire set down the instant coffee, picked up the real one. "Victor," Claire said. Agatha didn't answer. Which was the answer? They stood on the porch for a while without talking. The morning was cold and clear, and the trees were perfectly still, and Claire's mind was not. So Eleanor had been building this for 6 years. Not just the room. Not just the files. She'd positioned a person. A retired county employee who knew the land records system and lived close enough to observe, but far enough to be unremarkable. 6 years. And Claire had spent that entire time thinking Eleanor was just distant, private, hard to reach. The grandmother who called occasionally and listened well and never explained herself. She had not been distant. She had been working. "She didn't tell me," Claire said. "She told you what you needed to know when she needed you to know it." Agatha took a sip of coffee. That was how she operated. That's one way to describe it. What's another way? Claire looked out at the tree line. Lonely. Agatha was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, that too. Inside, the morning light moved across the floor in a long rectangle from the east window. Claire watched it while she ate the sandwich. Agatha had brought plain egg and sharp cheddar on sourdough, still warm, and let herself think. Agatha sat across the table with her own coffee, not filling the silence, which Claire appreciated more than she could have explained. You worked at the county office, Claire said finally. Land Records Division. 22 years. So you know the filing systems. Who requests what? When I know how to read a request log. Yes. Victor requested access to Crofton County land records. Claire said it flatly. Not a question, because she already knew from the files Eleanor had kept. She just wanted to hear it confirmed by a living person. Agatha set down her cup. 11 times. Between October 2018 and March 2022. Never under his own name. Always through a different LLC or a different requesting party. But the parcel numbers were the same. This parcel. She touched the table lightly. And the 3 adjacent ones he's been quietly acquiring. Claire absorbed that. Adjacent ones. He owns 2 of them outright through holding companies. The 3rd is under contract. Agatha's voice was matter of fact. Not dramatic. Just stating the record. He's been assembling a land package. This property is the center of it. Why this one specifically? Agatha looked at her for a moment. That's a good question, she said. One I suspect you'll find the answer to before I could tell you. Which meant she knew and was choosing not to say. Which meant it was something Claire needed to find herself. Which was, Claire thought with a fresh wave of irritation, extremely Eleanor of everyone in Eleanor's orbit. She drank her coffee. She did not throw anything. After Agatha left, Claire went back to the hidden room and opened the 2021 folder. This one was different from the others. The previous folders had been Eleanor's documentation, careful, sequential, annotated. The 2021 folder was a prepared case. There was a table of contents on the first page, handwritten. 12 sections, each one tabbed. Tab 1. The original trust documents establishing the family holding trust, dating back to 1989, with specific clauses highlighted in yellow pencil, Eleanor's handwriting noting each one. Tab 2. Disbursement records from the trust, 2015 through 2019. Tab 3. The transfer records she'd already seen in the earlier folders, now compiled in a summary format with totals. $340,000. Moved from the family trust into Victor Langley's personal LLC over 4 years. Labeled as management fees. For management services that, as Eleanor had noted in her careful handwriting on a separate page, were never rendered. Tab 4. A copy of an IRS complaint, anonymous. Filed October 2019. Claire stared at that one for a long time. She read it carefully. It was a detailed complaint, specific enough to suggest the person who filed it had real knowledge of Eleanor's financial arrangements. It alleged unreported income from the Crofton property. Specifically, it referenced the Ashford Land Trust, the property registration, and suggested that Eleanor had been using the trust structure to shelter income from taxation. The complaint was wrong. She could see that from the tax records Eleanor had included in tab 5. Everything was properly reported. The land trust had been established legally in 1998 and had been in full compliance every year since. The IRS investigation, which Eleanor had summarized in a 1-page chronology in tab 6, had taken 23 months and found nothing actionable. But in those 23 months, Eleanor's 2 business operating accounts had been frozen pending investigation. Frozen accounts. For nearly 2 years. Eleanor would have been 76, 77 by the time it resolved, running a real estate business with her operating accounts locked. Claire thought about that for a moment. What that would do to a person's ability to move assets, to complete transactions, to maintain properties. What it would do to someone's ability to prepare a clean estate transfer. It would slow everything down, create uncertainty, create pressure to liquidate, which was, she realized, exactly the point. She turned to tab 7, a single page. Eleanor's handwriting dated January 2020, midway through the IRS investigation. The complaint was filed by someone who understood the land trust structure well enough to name it specifically and frame the allegation plausibly. The number of people with that level of knowledge is small. I have spent 3 months narrowing it. I am now certain. I am not surprised. I am deciding what to do about it. Below that, in smaller writing, as if added later, I have decided. I will document and wait. The right moment requires the right person. I don't have that person yet. Claire sat back from the table, the right person. She looked at the filing cabinets along the wall, at the 4 folders laid out on the work table, at her own name on the box. She felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, exactly. More like the feeling you get when you find the load-bearing wall you were looking for. The thing that explains the structure. The thing everything else is built around. Eleanor had known, had figured it out, had spent years documenting it, building the case, filing it carefully in a room she'd had built using Claire's own design logic, and had waited for 6 years for the right person. The right person had not shown up while Eleanor was alive. Claire was the right person. Arriving late. Too late to tell Eleanor she understood. Too late to say whatever needed to be said. But not too late for everything else. She closed the folder, set it with the others, went back to the main room and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the tree line. The north tree line specifically. The land sloped that way. She'd noticed it that morning from the porch. Dropped gently toward the north and leveled out somewhere she couldn't see. 200 acres. She still didn't know what was on most of it. She went and got her boots. She walked the property for 2 hours that afternoon, starting from the structure and working outward in rough concentric arcs, the way she'd been trained to approach an unfamiliar site. Not wandering, mapping. She had the notebook and she made rough sketches as she went, noting the terrain, the tree types, the places where the ground changed character, softer, rockier, different vegetation patterns. The north end of the property was the most interesting. The land dropped into a shallow valley, maybe 40 feet of elevation change over the course of a quarter mile, and at the base of it the soil changed. She could feel it through her boots, firmer, less give, more rocky outcrops visible through the leaf litter, and the rock was a different color than what she'd seen higher up. Darker, blue-gray, dense-looking. She wasn't a geologist. She couldn't name it. But she'd done enough structural assessments to know that the rock composition underneath a property affected everything: foundation design, drainage, load-bearing capacity. This looked different from the granite she was used to seeing in the Richmond Basin. Harder, more uniform. She noted it, sketched the rough location, kept walking. On the way back, she found the survey markers. 3 of them, iron pipes with orange caps, positioned along the north boundary line. Standard county survey markers. She photographed them with her phone and noted their positions relative to her sketch. Back at the structure, she added the afternoon's observations to her notebook. Terrain changes. Rock outcrops at the north end. 3 boundary markers. Estimated tree stand ages in different sections. The east quadrant was older growth, 60 or 70 years minimum based on trunk diameter. The west side was younger, more mixed, maybe replanted at some point. 200 acres. Beginning to feel like a real thing rather than an abstract number on a document. Her phone had 1 bar of signal near the south window of the main room. She used it to call Pembert Ring. "I'm at the property," she said. "I know. Of course he did. I've read the folders in the box." Silence. Then all four, another silence. Longer. "Then you understand why your grandmother was specific about the timing of this conversation. I understand what she documented. I don't understand everything she decided." "Those are different questions," Pemberton said. Exactly what Eleanor would have said. "What do you need from me?" "The IRS complaint. Tab 4. I need to know if there's a way to trace the source of an anonymous complaint." A pause. "Not through official channels. Not easily. But there are patterns. Specific knowledge. The way a complaint is worded tells you things about who wrote it, if you know what to look for." "I know what to look for," Claire said. "I need a copy of the original submission document, not just Eleanor's copy. I'll make some calls. One more thing." She looked at the north window, the tree line, the direction of the valley she'd walked that afternoon, the land trust documentation in tab 1. "Is there anything in there about a geological assessment of the property?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Why do you ask?" "Because the rock formation on the north end of this property doesn't look like background geology. It looks like something specific. And Victor has been assembling adjacent parcels for 5 years. Pemberton was quiet for 4 full seconds. In a man his age who chose his words carefully, 4 seconds was significant. "I'll look at the trust documentation again," he said. "I'll be in touch." He hung up. Claire looked at the phone. 1 bar. Then none. She set it down on the table and went back to looking at the north window. Agatha came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She didn't announce these visits or explain them. She just showed up with real coffee and sometimes food and occasionally information, offered in the same flat, factual tone she used for everything. She was not warm, exactly, but she was consistent, and consistency was something Claire had been short on lately. On the third morning, Claire asked the question she'd been sitting on. How often did Eleanor come here? Agatha thought about it. 4 or 5 times a year. Sometimes more, she'd stay a week. Sometimes 2. By herself. Always by herself. Agatha wrapped both hands around her mug. She'd work on the property. The garden on the east side, she put that in herself. Over about 3 summers, she cut trails through the east wood. She'd walk them in the mornings. She paused. She wasn't quiet here the way she was in Richmond. She talked more. Eleanor talked more here than in Richmond. To me, yes. When she wanted to. Claire tried to fit this into the Eleanor she knew. The Richmond Eleanor polished, contained, the woman who entered a room and calibrated it within 30 seconds. The Eleanor who had never once raised her voice in Claire's presence. Not out of restraint, but because she genuinely did not seem to feel the need. What did she talk about? Claire said. Agatha considered this for a while, long enough that Claire thought she might not answer. Then what she'd gotten wrong, mostly. Not regrets, she wasn't that kind of person. More like accounting. What decisions had cost more than she'd expected. What she'd undervalued. She looked at the tree line. She talked about you toward the end. Claire waited. She said she'd watched you work from a distance for a long time, that you'd gotten better at the professional part than she'd expected, which she found gratifying, but that you'd also gotten more alone than she'd intended. Agatha glanced at her. Her word, not mine. Intended. As if Claire's life had been something Eleanor was managing, which was infuriating and also accurate, apparently, in ways Claire hadn't known. She intended for me to be less alone. She intended for you to have a place to land when you needed one. Agatha said it simply. Whether you ended up alone or not wasn't her decision, but she could make sure there was somewhere solid to stand. Claire looked at the building behind her, the solid floor, the sealed walls, the work that was in it. Yeah, she thought. That tracks. The call from Pemberton came 4 days after she'd asked about the geological assessment. I found the document you were looking for, he said. It was in the trust files, not in the Crofton operational records. Your grandmother had it filed under a different reference, so it wouldn't be immediately associated with the property. What is it? A geological survey, commissioned in 2019 by a company called Blue Ridge Minerals, LLC. He paused. Which is a subsidiary of a holding company called Crofton Land Partners, which is owned, through 2 intermediate entities, by Victor Langley. The room went very quiet. Not dramatic quiet. Just still. The way a room gets when you've found the structural element that explains everything else. The load-bearing point. The thing the whole design depends on. He commissioned his own survey, Claire said, in 2019. The same year the IRS complaint was filed. What does the survey say? Pemberton read from the document. His voice was even. Just the facts, the way Eleanor would have done it. The survey had identified a significant deposit of blue granite on the north portion of the Crofton property, high grade, consistent quality, suitable for architectural and monumental applications. Estimated extractable volume placed the commercial value of the deposit at 2022 market rates, at approximately $38 million. Claire sat down on the couch. She hadn't meant to. Her legs just decided. $38 million. In the ground. On the north end of her property. The ground she'd walked 4 days ago and felt through her boots. The blue-gray rock she'd photographed and noted as specific and different. He knew in 2019, she said. The survey was completed in August 2019. The IRS complaint was filed in October 2019. She didn't say anything for a moment, because you didn't have to say it. The sequence said it. Survey in August, complaint in October. He found out what the land was worth. Then he filed a complaint that would freeze Eleanor's accounts and create financial pressure on a 76-year-old woman to liquidate, while he assembled the adjacent parcels, while he positioned himself to make an offer. Eleanor saw this, Claire said. The survey document in the trust files has a notation in your grandmother's hand, a rustling of paper. It says she must have found a copy of it somehow, because this is her copy with her notes. It says, The timing was intentional. He needed 18 months to acquire the adjacent parcels. The IRS complaint would have created enough uncertainty to prompt a sale. He underestimated how long I would hold. Claire read that sentence 3 times in her head. He underestimated how long I would hold. Eleanor at 76, accounts frozen. Victor acquiring the pieces around her. The whole architecture of a trap closing in. And Eleanor had just held. For 2 years of investigation. For 6 more years of documentation, held until she died. And then she'd handed it to Claire. Not because Claire was family. Because Claire would hold 2. The adjacent parcels, Claire said. He owns 2 of them. Outright. Yes, and the 3rd is under contract, was under contract. The contract expired last month. The seller terminated because Victor missed a payment deadline. A brief pause. It went back on the market 3 days ago. He missed a payment because the estate is in dispute and his liquidity is tied up in legal fees. That would be consistent with the timeline, yes. Claire stood up, went to the window. The north tree line. The slope of the land going down into the valley. $38 million in the ground. And Victor knew it. And Eleanor had known Victor knew it. And now Claire knew all of it. Pemberton, she said. Yes. When Victor comes here, and he will, I need to know everything that the trust gives me authority to do with this property. Every legal protection Eleanor put in place. I've been preparing that summary since the day of the reading, he said. I'll send it through the post. Why not email? Because some things shouldn't be on a server. She looked at the tree line for another moment. Then, one more thing. The anonymous complaint to the IRS. Were you able to trace anything? The complaint was submitted through a digital portal. No signature. But the language in Section 4 of the document uses terminology specific to the Virginia Land Trust Act of 1997, very specific. The kind of specificity you'd have if you'd read the statute closely. There are not many people who would phrase it that way. Victor would. Victor or his attorney. Yes, but not provable. Not without the original IP address from the submission portal, which is sealed. Pemberton paused, however. The document makes an error in Section 7. It references the wrong subsection of the IRS code for the alleged violation subsection C instead of subsection D. Someone who was guessing at the relevant law might make that error. Someone who knew the law well would not. Victor knows the law well. Very well. So it wasn't Victor who drafted the complaint, but someone with less specific tax knowledge working from Victor's description of the situation. A paralegal, a junior associate. That would be consistent. Claire thought about that. Victor careful enough not to write it himself. Smart enough to use an intermediary. But the intermediary hadn't gotten the subsection right. Small things. Pemberton had always told her, she'd heard it secondhand from Eleanor, that the truth lived in the small things. Because people carefully hid the large things and forgot to hide the small ones. Okay, she said. Send the trust summary. And Pemberton in the trust documentation. Is there anything about the mineral rights? The pause that followed was just long enough to tell her. The mineral rights to the Crofton property, Pemberton said, are held by the Ashford Land Trust and transfer with the property. They are specifically enumerated in the deed. Eleanor was very precise about this. Because she knew. Because she's Eleanor Ashford. He said it with something that might, from a different man, have been a smile. She was precise about everything. After she hung up, Claire stood at the window for a long time. The north tree line. The slope. The blue-gray rock she'd photographed and noted and now understood. $38 million. That Victor had been circling for 5 years. That Eleanor had been protecting for 6. That was now sitting in the ground under 200 acres of Virginia Blue Ridge. And it was hers, and Victor knew it was hers. And he was going to come here. She knew it the way she knew a structure was compromised before she'd finished the assessment. Not from one thing. From all the things together. He would come. And she needed to be ready. She went back to the hidden room. Opened the filing cabinet on the left. Started reading from the oldest documents forward. This time without stopping. Not looking for one thing. Looking at the whole picture. The way you had to look at a building when you were trying to understand not just what was wrong with it but why it had been built the way it had in the first place. 2 hours in, she found something she hadn't seen in her first pass. A folder at the back of the 3rd cabinet drawer behind the older operational records. Thin. One document inside. A letter handwritten on plain paper, dated September 2023, 2 months before Eleanor died. It was addressed to no one. I have held this property for 25 years against the reasonable advice of everyone who knew about it. People thought it was sentiment. It was not sentiment. It was the understanding that the things worth holding are always the things that look wrong to everyone else at first. The right person will see it correctly, not because they love it, because they know how to look. That's the only qualification that matters. Not blood, not loyalty, not good intentions. The ability to look at something and see it as it actually is. Claire has that. She always has. I just needed her to need it enough to come and use it. Claire read that letter twice. The building around her settled in the cold with a small sound. Just timber and temperature doing what they do. She folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the folder. She needed her to need it enough to come and use it. In another life, in another version of this story, Claire might have felt manipulated by that. Set up, maneuvered, except. She looked around the hidden room. The filing cabinets. The carefully organized folders. The box with her name on it. The building itself rebuilt according to her drawings by a 76-year-old woman who had not asked for credit or explanation. Eleanor hadn't set a trap. She'd built a foundation. Deliberately, patiently, with better materials than anyone had asked for. And she'd left it for Claire to stand on. She closed the folder. She went back to the main room and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook to the list she'd started 3 days ago. What does Victor know that he thinks I don't? She crossed it out, wrote underneath it. What does Victor know that he doesn't know I know? That was the right question. She started writing. They arrived on a Tuesday. Claire heard the cars before she saw them. 2 engines. One of them familiar, that particular smooth idol of a vehicle that cost more than most people's mortgages. She was in the hidden room when the sound reached her, reviewing the trust summary Pemberton had sent, and she closed the folder and put it in the cabinet, and closed the cabinet door before she did anything else. Slow, deliberate, no rushing. She came out of the hidden room, closed the north door, checked that it looked like a wall, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank half of it standing at the counter, set it down. Then she went to the front door and opened it before they knocked. Victor. And behind him Diana, in a coat that had not been purchased for outdoor fieldwork. And behind Diana, a man Claire didn't recognize, mid-40s, briefcase. The particular expression of a lawyer who'd been told this was a simple site visit and was already revising that assessment. Victor, Claire said. Claire. He looked at her with that quick, thorough assessment she'd clocked at the reception. Then at the building behind her. The porch, the siding, the roofline. His eyes moved the way hers did, which she found unsettling. He knew how to read a structure. You look settled. I am, good. He smiled. We're here on behalf of the estate. Routine inspection. The court wants documentation of the property condition during the dispute period. Claire looked at the lawyer. Court order. The lawyer opened the briefcase. Produced a document. Claire took it, read it. Careful, all the way through. It was real. Judge Whitmore, Crofton County. Property inspection authorized for the purpose of establishing current condition and value. Value. That word. She handed it back. Come in, she said. They came in. Diana looked at the interior with an expression she was trying to control and not entirely succeeding. The clean floors. The working kitchen. The functioning lights and the heat that had been running for a week and done its job. She'd been expecting a wreck and gotten something else, and she didn't know what to do with that. Victor was more interesting. He was doing what Claire did. Reading the room. Moving through it slowly. Touching things, the wall surface, the window trim, the kitchen countertop with the flat of his hand. Taking inventory. And then he walked toward the north end of the interior. The bedroom. Claire watched him from the main room. Watched him go through the bedroom door, heard him stop. A moment. Then his footsteps again, moving along the north wall of the bedroom, back and forth. Slow. He came back out. Storage room at the north end, he said. Mechanical access, Claire said. Heat pump system. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Can I see it? The inspection order covers accessible and finished spaces, Claire said. Mechanical access panels are not finished space. You're welcome to have the court amend the order. The lawyer cleared his throat. She's correct. Victor looked at Claire. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. because she knew what he was looking for. And he knew she knew. And they were both standing there, not saying it in front of a lawyer and his wife. And it was almost funny. Almost. Diana had moved to the window on the south wall and was looking out at the clearing. "It's actually quite peaceful," she said. "The kind of thing people say when they're trying to recalibrate." "It is," Claire agreed. Victor pulled out his phone and took photographs. Methodical. The room, the kitchen, the floors, the windows. He walked to the east end, photographed the chimney connection. He went to the back door, opened it, photographed the exterior foundation from the doorway. He did all of this without explaining himself, and Claire let him do it, and she stood in the main room and watched. She was particularly interested in where he pointed the camera. Not at the walls, not at the ceiling, not at the porch or the windows or any of the things that would matter in a standard condition assessment. He photographed the floors, specifically the corners, the places where flooring met walls, the north end of the main room, the bedroom, the north corner of the bedroom 3 times. He was trying to read the subfloor, from above, looking for evidence of what was underneath. She knew this because she would have done the same thing. After 40 minutes they left. The lawyer first, then Diana, then Victor, who paused on the porch and turned back to her with his hand on the rail. "The property has been improved," he said. "Yes, significantly." He was looking at the siding. "When was the work done?" "It's documented in the county permit records," Claire said. "Everything was properly filed." He looked at her, the way he'd looked at her at the reception. Quick, thorough, then away. Except this time he didn't look away as fast. "How are you holding up?" he said. "Really?" "Fine," she said. "Really?" He nodded. Got in the car, drove away. She stood on the porch until the sound of both engines faded into the tree line. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands, not falling apart, just thinking. Because that had been a reconnaissance mission, not an inspection. He'd gotten what he came for, which was confirmation that the property was in better condition than he'd expected, and that there was something at the north end he couldn't access yet. And he'd learned that Claire knew what the inspection order covered and knew how to use that knowledge. He was recalibrating, the way Diana had at the window. But more dangerous, she needed to move faster. She called Pemberton from the south window 1 bar, the signal dropping every 30 seconds. He was looking at the north end, she said, specifically the subfloor corners in the bedroom. He's trying to confirm the geology from above. Pemberton's voice was calm. He knows a geological survey from the surface doesn't give you everything. He'd want to know if there's been any drilling or core sampling on the property. Has there been? Not to my knowledge. And I would know it requires a county permit. So he doesn't have confirmation beyond the surface survey he commissioned in 2019. Correct. He has very strong evidence of a significant deposit. He doesn't have the certainty that comes from core samples. But he knows what the north end looks like from the surface. Yes. So do I, Claire said. I walked it. I photographed it. I've been looking at the rock outcrops every day. She paused. Pemberton, I need to understand the legal position. If I commission a geological assessment my own, as property owner, what does that do to the estate dispute? A pause. It doesn't affect the dispute directly. You have full authority as deed holder to commission assessments. The dispute is over the validity of the transfer of the deed, not your rights as current holder. Another pause. However, if the assessment confirms significant mineral value, it does affect the stakes. It makes the dispute more worth pursuing for Victor. And it becomes a matter of public record, which Victor could access. If he knew to look for it, he'd look for it. Yes, Claire thought about this. A confirmed geological assessment was a sword that cut both ways. It established the value she needed to protect, and it told Victor exactly what he was fighting for. What if, she said slowly, I commission it in a way that it's accurate and legal and fully documented, but the results aren't filed publicly until the estate dispute is resolved. The assessment itself is private. Only the county permit for the physical work would be public record. The results go to the property owner. How quickly can I get a crew out here? I know someone, Pemberton said. Old client. Retired from the industry, she consults now. Give me 2 days. 1, Claire said. A pause. I'll call her today. She hung up. Stood at the window. 1 bar, then none. The tree line in the early afternoon light. The north slope. Somewhere under there, $38 million sitting in the dark and the cold and the rock, waiting. She'd been waiting too. She was done with that. Agatha came by that afternoon, which was not her usual time. She sat at the kitchen table and listened while Claire walked her through the visit: Victor, Diana, the lawyer, the inspection order, the photographs. He took pictures of the floor corners, Agatha said. 3 shots of the north bedroom corner. Smart. She said it without admiration. Just accuracy. He can't get a survey permit without your consent, so he's trying to gather surface evidence. Which I knew. Claire sat down across from her. What I need to know is whether he can get a court order compelling access for a geological assessment. Agatha was quiet for a moment. During an estate dispute? Possibly. If he can argue it's necessary to establish the full value of the disputed asset. She looked at the table. He'd need a judge who agreed that mineral rights were central to the valuation question. That's not guaranteed, but it's possible. How long would it take him to prepare that motion, Victor? A week. Maybe less. She looked up. You're thinking about moving first. Agatha looked at her for a moment. Eleanor would have done exactly that, she said. Same order of operations. Which was, Claire supposed, the point. Pemberton's contact arrived 2 days later. Her name was Dorothea Fenn, 68. Former field geologist with the State Survey. Spent 20 years after that consulting for mining and land use projects throughout Virginia and West Virginia. She drove a truck older than Claire's, and she carried her own equipment, and she did not make small talk. Show me the north end, she said. Claire walked her down the slope. Dorothea moved differently than Claire moved, not reading the surface for evidence of structure, but reading it for what was underneath. She'd stop, crouch, pick up a piece of rock, look at it, set it down. She'd tap the exposed outcrops with a small hammer and listen to the sound. She used a device Claire didn't recognize that she held against the rock surface and noted numbers from. It took most of the day. At 4 in the afternoon, they came back to the main room, and Dorothea sat at the kitchen table and wrote in her own notebook for 15 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. The 2019 survey was accurate, she said. Blue granite. High grade. The deposit is larger than they estimated, not smaller. Claire had been expecting this. She'd been expecting it for days, and still, how much larger? The 2019 survey estimated the deposit at about 60 acres. Based on what I'm seeing on the surface, I'd estimate 75 to 80. The outcrops on the eastern edge aren't consistent with the deposit boundary. They look like the edge of the main deposit, continuing undercover. Dorothea tapped her pen on the notebook. To be definitive, I'd need core samples. But I've been doing this for 40 years. The surface indicators are very clear. 75 to 80 acres. The 2019 estimate had put value at 38 million based on 60. The math was straightforward, and Claire did it without reaching for a calculator. The adjacent parcels Victor controls, Claire said. Do they have exposure on this deposit? Dorothea looked at her. Possibly. The deposit could extend beyond your boundary line. But the center of mass where extraction would begin, where the most accessible and highest quality material is clearly within your property. Meaning, without my property, the adjacent parcels are much less valuable. Meaning, without your property, the adjacent parcels are essentially worthless for extraction purposes. You'd be trying to mine the edge of a deposit you couldn't access the core of. She closed the notebook. He needs your land. Not just as part of the package. He needs it as the foundation. Claire was quiet for a moment. She thought about the IRS complaint. October 2019, 2 months after the survey. Victor knowing exactly what was under this land and then spending 5 years trying to position himself to take it. The adjacent parcels, the legal pressure, the estate dispute. 5 years of patient, methodical work, against 6 years of Eleanor's patient, methodical documentation. And now Claire, at the kitchen table, with Dorothea Fenn's 40 years of experience sitting across from her, and a timeline she understood and a body of evidence that would hold. I need the assessment documented, Claire said, formally, in a way that establishes my understanding of the deposit as prior to any court order Victor might seek. Dorothea looked at her. You want to timestamp your knowledge. I want to timestamp the property owner's knowledge, yes. I can have a preliminary written assessment to you by Friday. Dorothea stood. I'll include the date of today's site visit in the header. She picked up her jacket. Your grandmother hired me in 2021, by the way. Asked me to review the 2019 survey and tell her if it was accurate. Claire looked at her. She didn't tell you, Dorothea said. Not a question, no. She never did. Dorothea put on her jacket. But she kept every piece of paper I gave her. I assume you've found them. I found a lot of things, Claire said. Dorothea nodded and picked up her equipment bag. At the door she paused. The person who commissioned the 2019 survey didn't understand what they were looking at. Not fully. They saw the deposit and they saw the number and they stopped there. She looked at the north window. The reason this land was worth protecting wasn't just the granite. It's the water table. The formation that holds the granite also holds one of the cleanest aquifer systems in the western part of the state. If you extract the granite wrong, you compromise the water. She looked back at Claire. Your grandmother understood that. She had a hydrology report done in 2022. It should be in the files. She left. Claire sat at the table for a long time after the truck sound faded. Hydrology report. 2022. She hadn't found it yet, but she would. She went back to the hidden room. Third cabinet. Bottom drawer. Behind the insurance records. A folder with a blue tab labeled She Almost Smiled Water. Of course. She took it to the kitchen table and opened it. The hydrology report was 40 pages. Commissioned in May 2022 from an independent firm out of Roanoke. The findings were detailed and technical, and she moved through them carefully, translating the specialized language into things she knew how to think about. The core point, restated multiple times in multiple ways throughout the document, the granite formation on the north end of the Crofton property was the surface expression of a much larger subsurface system. This system included a significant aquifer, a deep, pressurized water body that supplied groundwater to a substantial portion of the surrounding watershed. Surface mining operations on the formation, if conducted without specific and expensive containment protocols, had a significant probability of breaching the aquifer. The result would be contamination of the regional groundwater supply. Significant probability. Regional contamination. Eleanor had known this for 2 years before she died. Victor didn't know this. His survey team had looked for extractable material and found it and stopped. They hadn't gone deeper, hadn't asked what else was down there, which meant his plan, extract the granite, sell it, profit, had a catastrophic flaw he didn't know about, and which meant that even if he got the land, he couldn't do what he planned to do with it without either spending an enormous amount on containment infrastructure or risking a regional environmental disaster. Claire closed the report. She sat very still, because here was the thing Eleanor had seen and documented and then not used, had not sent to the EPA, had not used to block extraction permits proactively, had not used to publicly discredit Victor's land acquisitions, had just filed and waited. Why? She turned the question over, let it sit, the way she let structural questions sit when the answer wasn't obvious yet, because Eleanor wouldn't use it as a weapon unless she had to. Because the same document that stopped Victor's plan also disclosed the aquifer to anyone who read it. And a significant aquifer disclosure in a land dispute could complicate things in ways Eleanor couldn't fully control. So she'd held it, the same way she'd held the transfer records, the same way she'd held everything. Documenting, waiting, trusting that the right person would know when and how to use it. Claire called Pemberton. He picked up on the first ring. The hydroastrology report, she said. A pause. Long enough to mean something. You found it. Yes. Does Victor know about the aquifer? Not to my knowledge. Pemberton's voice was careful. Your grandmother was very deliberate about keeping that document within a small circle. If he proceeds with an extraction operation without the containment protocols, he would be exposing himself to significant federal liability. Yes. And if I present this document in the context of the estate dispute, it becomes part of the public record, and Victor's attorneys would have access to it. Another pause. The question of how and when to disclose it is a strategic one. Your grandmother was still deciding when she died. Claire looked at the north window, the tree line, the slope. She was done waiting. Pemberton, she said, I need to see Victor. Not through lawyers, not through the court process. Before the next motion was filed, before the next inspection order, before Victor had a chance to reposition. Face to face. The meeting happened 3 days later. Claire drove to Richmond. She'd asked for neutral ground and they'd agreed on a coffee shop on Broad Street, the kind of place where business meetings happened all the time and nobody looked twice. Victor was already there when she arrived. Black coffee, untouched. He watched her come in and sit down without standing up, which told her he'd decided to play this as a conversation between equals rather than a power dynamic. which told her he'd done his own recalibrating since Tuesday. She ordered coffee. They sat with the noise of the place around them, other tables, the espresso machine, the particular low roar of a room full of people not listening to each other. "I know about the deposit," Claire said. "I know you do." No hesitation. "The assessment permit was filed 2 days ago. Then you know I have documentation of the property owner's prior knowledge of the mineral value." She held his gaze. "Which complicates your argument, that Eleanor wasn't aware of the full value of the property when she structured the bequest." He looked at her steadily. "It's a complication, not a fatal one." "No," she said. "This is a fatal one." She put a folder on the table. Not the hydrology report itself, a 3-page summary she'd written herself in plain language, with the key findings pulled out and cited. She put it face up in front of him and let him read. She watched his face. It didn't collapse. He was too controlled for that, but she saw the moment he understood what it meant. A stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Not calm. Arrested. He read it twice. Set it down. "The aquifer," he said. "The containment requirement would add approximately 9 to 12 million to the extraction cost before operations begin." She kept her voice even. "Just the facts. Eleanor's way. That changes the economics significantly. Not fatally, depends on your financing structure." She folded her hands on the table. "And it depends on whether the EPA is notified of the aquifer's existence before or after you acquire the land. Because if they're notified before, any extraction plan requires prior approval and full environmental impact review, which takes, on average, 3 to 5 years. She paused. "And which is triggered by a public disclosure of the hydrology data." He was looking at her. The way he'd looked at her in the study after the reading, reassessing. "You'd disclose it," he said, "if I have to. That affects more than just extraction. A significant aquifer disclosure affects property values across the watershed. The adjacent parcels you've been acquiring would be, I know, you'd be affecting your own property value." "I know that too." He was quiet, long enough that she let the silence hold without filling it. "You have the trust records," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "The transfers." "Yes," she documented them. Not a question either. Just a man understanding what had been happening while he thought he was watching. "For 6 years," Claire said. "Starting in 2017. Something moved through his face. Too fast to name completely. Not regret he wasn't there yet. Something more like recognition. The way you look when you realize you've been thinking about the wrong problem. "Why are you telling me this directly?" he said. "You could have let it come out in discovery." "Because I'm not interested in destroying you," Claire said. "I'm interested in keeping the property." "Those aren't the same objective." "No, they're not." She looked at him. Eleanor had everything she needed to refer the transfer records to the state attorney's office. She didn't do it. She wanted it over her head. Maybe. Or maybe she just didn't want to spend the last years of her life in a legal war with her nephew. She paused. Or maybe she thought there was a version of this where you made a different choice, and that possibility was worth preserving. Victor looked down at the summary on the table, at his coffee still untouched, at nothing. "The third adjacent parcel," he said finally. "The contract expired." "I know. I missed the payment, I know." He was quiet again. "I've been putting money into this for 5 years. The 2 parcels I own, the legal costs for the estate dispute I know," she said. "I'm not saying this to be unkind. I'm saying it because I think you should understand the full picture before you decide how to proceed." He looked at her. "You sound like her." "I'll take that. It wasn't entirely a compliment." "I know that too." He picked up his coffee finally. Drank some, set it down. The muscle in his jaw moved once and then stilled. "If I drop the estate dispute," he said, "then the trust records stay where they are, and the hydrology report is filed with the county as part of standard land documentation, which I'm required to do anyway but without any additional notification. That's not amnesty. No, it's not. The records exist. They'll exist regardless of what you do. But there's a difference between existing and being actively used." She looked at him. Eleanor understood that difference. She lived with it for 6 years. He was quiet for a long time. The coffee shop moved around them. The espresso machine, the low roar. "I need to talk to my attorney," he said. "Of course. This isn't a decision I make in a coffee shop." "I didn't expect it to be." He stood, picked up his jacket. He was looking at the table, not at her, and she let him do that. Then he looked up. "She left you the land," he said. "Not because you're her granddaughter. Is that what you think?" "Yes. Because you'd hold it. Because I'd understand what it was worth holding. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Just barely. And he walked out. Claire sat at the table with her coffee cooling and the summary still on the table in front of her. Through the window she watched him get into his car. Sit there for a moment. Pull out into traffic. She thought about Eleanor at 76, with frozen accounts and a nephew she'd raised from a boy and 6 years of patient documentation ahead of her. How that must have felt. To know what you knew and have to just hold it. Wait. She understood it better now than she had 3 weeks ago. She picked up the summary, folded it, put it back in the folder. That night she sat at the kitchen table in the building Eleanor had built with her drawings and read through the hydrology report again, all 40 pages, this time looking for the water rather than the liability. The aquifer was deep, pressurized. The geologic formation dated it at several thousand years. It fed springs on the east side of the property and connected to the watershed below. It was the reason the soil at the north end was different. The reason the vegetation patterns she'd noticed on her first walk were what they were. The land was built on water. Underneath the granite, underneath the rock, underneath everything that had made it valuable to Victor water, clean and old and pressurized, moving through the dark. Eleanor had known. Of course she had. She'd had it surveyed. She'd read the report. And she'd understood that protecting the land meant protecting what was underneath it, which was something a mining operation would never do. Claire looked at the kitchen window. The north tree line in the dark. Just shapes. She thought about what the right person meant. Not the person with the most leverage. Not the person who could fight hardest. The person who would understand what they were standing on. She understood now. She opened her notebook and started writing. Not a list. Not documentation. Just what she knew in order the way Eleanor had done it. Starting with what the building was made of and working down to the water underneath it. Everything that held. The court order arrived on a Thursday. Not by courier this time. By regular mail in a plain envelope with the Crofton County court seal in the upper left corner. Claire found it in the mailbox at the end of the access lane when she walked down to check something she'd started doing every morning, partly for the walk, and partly because the access lane was the one place on the property where she got 2 consistent bars of signal. She stood at the mailbox and opened it right there. 1 page. Judge Whitmore's signature at the bottom, the ink slightly uneven the way signatures get when someone has signed the same document format 100 times and stopped thinking about it. The estate dispute dismissed with prejudice. The Ashford Land Trust transfer, confirmed valid and legally unassailable. Her name on the deed as sole beneficiary, in full accordance with Eleanor Ashford's will as executed and notarized. She read it once, all the way through. Then she folded it along the envelope's original crease and put it in her jacket pocket and walked back up the lane toward the building. The air was cold. December in the Blue Ridge. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically but was simply there, settled into everything. The gravel under her boots. The bare branches of the trees on both sides of the lane. The particular quality of the light low and angled, making long shadows of ordinary things. She didn't call Pemberton immediately. She didn't call anyone. She walked past the building, past the south-facing porch. Around the east side where the old garden beds Eleanor had planted were now just brown stalks and frozen soil waiting for spring. She kept walking north. She hadn't been to the north slope since the morning Pemberton had called with the news about the withdrawal. Since she'd stood up there with the granite under her boots and felt the newsland. She'd been meaning to go back. She just hadn't yet. Now she did. The slope dropped away from the building's north side gradually at first, then more steeply. She picked her way through the leaf litter carefully frozen on top, soft underneath, the kind of footing that looked stable and wasn't. The temperature dropped a few degrees as she descended. That was the formation. The rock held the cold differently than the soil above it. She reached the largest of the outcrops and stopped. Blue-gray granite exposed at the surface, running roughly northeast to southwest the way Dorothea had mapped it. Dense. Old. The kind of rock that had been here long before anyone had thought to assign a value to it and would be here long after the number stopped mattering. She put her hand on it. Cold. Obviously cold. But solid in a way that was different from just temperature. There was weight in it. History. The feeling of something that had been compressed and shaped over a span of time that made human planning feel like a very small thing. $38 million. In the ground. Under her hand. and she was going to protect it. Not extract it, not sell the rights to it. Protect it specifically, permanently, through a conservation easement that would make extraction legally impossible in perpetuity. She'd made that decision 2 days ago, after reading the hydrology report for the 3rd time, and understanding not just what the aquifer was but what it fed, the farms downstream, the wells, the water that people who didn't know this property existed were drinking because this formation had been holding it for longer than anyone could reasonably imagine. She hadn't told anyone yet, not Pemberton, not Agatha. She'd wanted to sit with it for a full 48 hours before she said it out loud, to make sure it wasn't a decision she was making from emotion, from Eleanor, from wanting to do the thing Eleanor would have done. It wasn't. She'd checked. She would have made this decision regardless of Eleanor, because the water was real, and the damage from extraction done wrong was real, and $38 million was a number that required destroying something to access, and she didn't want to destroy anything here. She stood on the granite for a few minutes, long enough to be sure. Then she took out her phone 1 bar, barely, and called Pemberton. He picked up on the 2nd ring. "I got the order," she said. "I know. I received a copy this morning." His voice was the same as always, even, unhurried. "How are you?" "Fine." She looked at the rock under her feet. "I want to move on the conservation easement, mineral and subsurface rights, the full 200 acres. I want to talk to the Blue Ridge Conservancy this week." A pause. "That's a permanent decision. I know what it is. The mineral value is." She said it without sharpness, just clearly. "I also know what the aquifer feeds downstream. I read the hydrology report. All 40 pages. She paused. Eleanor read it too. She made the same decision and just didn't have time to execute it. Silence on his end. The particular silence of a man who had been waiting for something and had just heard it. "I'll make the call today," he said. "Thank you." She looked up the slope toward the building, just visible through the bare trees. "One more thing. The adjacent parcels Victor acquired. Do we know what he's planning to do with them now? He's listed one for sale, the other he's holding. I expect he'll reassess his position on both once the easement is recorded." A pause. "Without your property, they're not what he thought they were." "No," she said. "They're not." She hung up, stood on the granite for another minute. The cold coming through her boots now, the rock conducting it efficiently. She didn't move yet, because she was thinking about Eleanor standing here. In the photograph in the folder, the later one, better image quality, Eleanor in her field coat looking down at this same rock with that expression that wasn't a smile and wasn't quite neutral either. The expression of a person who had made a decision and was living with it. Eleanor had stood on this rock, had put her own hand on it probably, had read the survey, understood the number, and decided the number wasn't the point, had decided the water was the point, and had then spent 2 more years of her life, 77, 78, dying maintaining the documentation, holding the case, waiting for the right person, not asking for help, not telling anyone, just holding. Claire understood that now in a way she hadn't 3 weeks ago, not just intellectually. She felt it in her body, standing on the cold rock. The particular weight of knowing something and choosing not to act on it yet, choosing instead to wait, to trust that the moment would come. She walked back up the slope. Her mother called that afternoon. Claire was at the south window, the one that got the most light at this hour, going through the Blue Ridge Conservancy's easement documentation she'd downloaded while she had signal. Her mother's name on the phone screen. She answered on the 2nd ring. "Pemberton sent me a copy of the filing," her mother said. "I figured it meant something had been decided." "I know." He said, "It's done." "It is." A silence. Not uncomfortable. Just her mother thinking before she spoke, which was something Claire had stopped expecting and was now remembering was actually how she operated. "Are you all right?" "Yes." Claire set down the documents. "Better than all right, I think. I'm still figuring out what that means. That's honest, I'm trying." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Then I've been thinking about something since we talked last week. About what she left you and why." A pause. "When you were coming up, she used to ask me about you. Not the way family asks, not 'Are you doing well? Are you happy?' She asked specific things. What project you were working on. What you'd said about a particular building or a client. She wanted to know how you thought." Claire looked at the window, the clearing beyond it, the tree line at the far edge. "I didn't know that," she said. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know what to do with it. She and I weren't close, your grandmother and I. You know that. And there was something about the way she asked about you that felt like she was tracking something I wasn't part of. It made me uncomfortable. A pause. I think I was a little jealous, if I'm honest, which is a strange thing to admit about your own mother and your own daughter. It's not strange. It is a little strange. Her mother's voice was dry but not unkind. What I'm saying is she chose you on purpose. Not because of me, not because of family obligation, because she saw something in the way you worked and she trusted it. That matters. I wanted to say it out loud. Claire didn't say anything for a moment, because there were things she could say and things she didn't have the right words for yet. And with her mother, she'd learning that silence wasn't the same as distance. Sometimes it was just the space between one honest thing and the next. She saw it before I did, Claire said finally. She often did. With people. A pause. I'm coming out in January. If the offer still stands. It stands, good. Her mother's voice shifted slightly, lighter. I'll bring real food. Pemberton mentioned something about instant coffee being involved. He's thorough, Claire said. He really is. After she hung up, she stayed at the window. The afternoon light was going. The way it went quickly in December, the sun dropping behind the ridge and taking the warmth with it. The clearing in front of her going from gold to gray, the tree line darkening. She thought about what her mother had said. About Eleanor asking specific questions. About the particular shape of attention that isn't warmth exactly, but is something a form of caring that runs through observation rather than through closeness, through watching what a person does rather than what they say. She knew that form. She'd practiced her own version of it her whole career. Walk into a building and don't listen to what the owner tells you. Look at what the building tells you. Watch the load-bearing elements. Read the evidence of choices made over time. Don't decide what you want to find before you've looked. Eleanor had applied that to people. To Claire specifically, which was uncomfortable, and also accurate. And also, she was realizing, a form of love. Strange and imperfect and filtered through a personality that had spent decades being necessary and hard, but love in the sense of sustained, careful, purposeful attention. The kind that shows up in a rebuilt slab and a set of preserved drawings and a hidden room full of documentation, and a letter dated 8 months before death that says, I was watching, the whole time. She pulled on her jacket and went outside. The air hit her cleanly. Cold enough to feel in her lungs the way she'd started to like. She walked to the east side of the property, which she hadn't explored as thoroughly as the north. The old growth section. The trees here were 60, 70 years old. Maybe more she'd estimated by trunk diameter on her first walk, but hadn't gone deep into it. She went deep into it now. The light was almost gone, but not quite. That threshold hour, not day and not night. The trees here were different from the north side. Taller. The canopy still held some shape even in December, the interlocking branches creating a kind of architecture overhead. Her boots on the frozen leaf litter made a sound she'd started to recognize as specific to this section, drier than the north slope, the soil composition different, better drained. She walked for 20 minutes without a destination. And then she found the spring. She almost missed it. A small sound, water moving, which she'd stopped expecting because everything around her was frozen. But there it was, a seep at the base of a large red oak, where the ground was slightly lower and the rock underneath must have been close enough to the surface to redirect the flow. Not dramatic, just water, moving slowly, finding its way down the slight gradient toward the east. She crouched and looked at it. The hydrology report had mentioned a spring on the east side. She'd noted it and moved on. But here it was in real life. Actual water, actual movement in December when everything else had locked down. She put her finger in it. Cold, obviously. But moving, the aquifer. The same water system she'd been reading about in 40 pages of technical documentation. The same water Victor's extraction plan would have put at risk. It was here. Small and easy to miss and completely real. She stayed crouched for a moment. Not dramatic. Just present with it. Then she stood up and walked back toward the building. Agatha's truck was in the clearing when she came out of the east wood. Of course it was. Agatha was sitting on the porch steps with a thermos and a paper bag, watching Claire emerge from the tree line. She didn't say anything until Claire was close enough for a normal conversation. East wood, Agatha said. Found the spring. It's easy to miss. I nearly did. Claire sat on the step below Agatha's, accepted the cup being poured. The cold had gone deep enough that the coffee was genuinely necessary rather than just welcome. Eleanor go out there often? Every time she came, Agatha wrapped both hands around her own cup. First morning always, before she did anything else. Claire looked at the tree line. The east wood dark now, the light fully gone. Why first? She said it was the most honest part of the property. Nothing about it made financial sense. Small spring, mature growth, no practical utility. She said it was the part that existed just because it existed. Agatha paused. She said that was worth looking at first before you started thinking about everything else. Claire sat with that, because it was very Eleanor. That specific combination of the practical and the philosophical, the way Eleanor never quite separated them. The water in the east wood wasn't valuable in the way the granite deposit was valuable, or the building was valuable. It was valuable in the way that a thing which simply exists and is clean and moving and real is valuable. Before the human categories get applied, she'd gone there without knowing why, without a plan or a purpose, just following the sound. Maybe she was more like Eleanor than she'd understood. I called Pemberton today, Claire said. Conservation easement, full mineral and subsurface rights. Agatha didn't react for a moment. Then she nodded. Slow and once. The aquifer. And the deposit. Both. Permanently. That's the right decision. I know, she would have made it years ago if she'd had time. I know that too. Claire looked at the cup in her hands. I wanted to make it myself. Not because it was hers. Because it's right. Agatha looked at her with the expression she had when she was deciding whether something needed to be said or whether it could be left to stand on its own. She decided to leave it. They sat on the steps until the cold became unreasonable. Then Agatha gathered her thermos and stood and said she'd come back Saturday, and Claire said fine, and Agatha walked to her truck without rushing and drove down the access lane and was gone. Claire went inside. The building settled around her, the small sounds of timber adjusting to temperature. She'd stopped noticing those sounds the first week. Now she heard them the way you hear a familiar house, not as noise but as the building doing what it does. Breathing in the way structures breathe, expanding and contracting and holding. She turned on the kitchen light. Made tea because the coffee from Agatha's thermos had been the last of her appetite for caffeine today. Stood at the counter while it steeped. On the table, the Conservancy documents. Her notebook opened to the page where she'd been tracking questions about the easement process. The court order which she'd taken out of her pocket when she came in and set flat on the table without ceremony. One page. Her name. Done. She picked up the court order and read it again. Not because she'd missed anything. Because she wanted to read it as a complete thing now that the day was finished and the decision was made and the spring in the east wood was doing what it did regardless. Then she set it down and went to the document room. She'd been thinking about something for 3 days. A specific piece of the archive she'd set aside when she found it in the second week, because she wasn't ready to look at it carefully. Not because it was overwhelming, because it required a kind of attention she hadn't had available yet. She'd known she'd come back to it. She was coming back to it now. It was the earliest folder in the first cabinet, 1998. The year Eleanor had established the Ashford Land Trust. The year she'd registered the Crofton property under the trust rather than her personal name. A decision that had protected it from every subsequent challenge, including Victor's. The folder contained the original trust documents, which Claire had read. But it also contained something else she'd noted and moved past. A single sheet of plain paper, not a legal document, handwritten, folded once and placed at the back of the folder behind the formal documents. She took it out now. Eleanor's handwriting. Younger than the letters Claire had received the letters from the desk drawer, and the box and the envelope from Pemberton. This handwriting had a different quality. Less controlled, more urgent somehow. Like someone writing quickly because they needed to get the thought down before they could talk themselves out of it. No date. But it was with the 1998 documents, so she could place it roughly. Eleanor would have been 54. I am making this because I don't trust what happens to things when one person holds them. I've watched what happens to things when one person holds them. They disappear into that person's decisions, their needs, their limitations. They stop being the thing they were and become whatever that person needs them to be. The land is not mine. I know that's a strange thing to write about something I'm in the process of legally securing. But it's true. I have a responsibility to it, which is different from ownership. I can protect it because I understand it and I have the resources to protect it right now. But I am one person and I will not always be here, and what happens after me matters as much as what I do now. So I'm building this to outlast me. The trust, the documentation, the record. I don't know yet who will be the right person to receive it. I know it won't be based on blood or relationship or any of the things estates are usually organized around. It will be based on whether that person can see the land correctly, whether they can look at it and read what it actually is rather than what they want it to be. I don't have that person yet, but I'll find them, or they'll find their way here when it's time. The main thing is that the structure holds until then. Claire read it twice. She was aware of something happening in her chest that she didn't immediately have a word for. Not grief, because that had a shape she recognized. Not just emotion in the general sense. Something more like alignment. The feeling of reading something that was written for a general purpose and finding that it describes exactly where you are right now. That the person who wrote it couldn't have known they were describing you and couldn't have known the precise circumstances, and yet here you were, reading it, and it was exactly right. Eleanor at 54, 25 years before she died. Writing in a folder that would sit in a filing cabinet in a hidden room of a property that wouldn't be fully understood for another quarter century, not knowing who the right person would be, trusting that they'd exist. That was the thing, wasn't it? Not just the planning, not just the documentation, the trust that went underneath all of it, the willingness to build something that you couldn't personally guarantee would reach the right hands, to do the work anyway, to hold it anyway. To believe that the structure would hold until then. Claire set the paper down carefully. She sat in the document room for a while. The pull-chain bulb above her, she'd replaced it with a proper fixture last week. A simple overhead with a wall switch, functional and unobtrusive. Eleanor would have done the same. She thought about the things she'd found in this room. The folders and the years and the careful annotations. The trust document from 1998. The letters written at different ages for different purposes, all pointing in the same direction. The photograph of Eleanor on the north slope that she'd left in its folder. The hydrology report and Dorothea's assessment and the IRS complaint that had been filed and failed. 40 years of material, organized by someone who understood that the record was the thing. That what you left behind in documented form was what survived your ability to defend it in person. And now it was hers, not just the property. The record. The 40 years of careful watching and writing down and waiting. She had an obligation to it. Not in the way of burden. In the way of responsibility that you actually want to carry because you understand what it's for. She got up, went to the work table, and opened her notebook to a clean page. At the top she wrote the date. Below that, what she was doing and why. The conservation easement and the reasoning behind it. The spring in the East Wood and what it connected to. The court order and what it confirmed. The things she'd decided and the things she was still working out. Not for anyone in particular. For the record. So there'd be a record, that was how you did it. Eleanor had shown her. You wrote it down. You kept it organized. You trusted that the right person would eventually need to read it. She wrote for an hour. When she stopped, her hand was tired and the room was colder than it had been. When she'd sat down, the heat cycling. The thermostat doing what thermostats did. She stretched her fingers. Read back over what she'd written. Solid. Clear. In the right order. She closed the notebook. There was one more thing. She'd known it was there since the second week. She'd been waiting until she was ready. She was ready now. The envelope Pemberton had held back, not the court order, which had come separately. The other one. The one he'd mentioned in passing during their first phone call from the property. Your grandmother left one final document with me directly. My instruction was to deliver it when the legal proceedings were fully resolved, not before. She'd asked him to bring it in person rather than mail it. He'd agreed without asking why, which was Pemberton. He'd come yesterday. Had driven out from Richmond without complaint. Sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes drinking coffee and asking her 3 specific questions about the easement process. And then handed her the envelope and said he'd see himself out. She'd put it on the work table in the document room. She'd known what it probably was. Another letter. Eleanor's handwriting on the front, her name, no date. She picked it up now. Heavy enough for 2 pages. Maybe 3. She opened it. 2 pages. Eleanor's handwriting, the later version more controlled than the 1998 note. The hand of a woman in her late 70s who had spent a lifetime writing things down, and had made every word a decision. Claire, I have written and discarded versions of this letter more times than I'd like to admit. Every version tried to explain too much. This one will try to say what matters and stop. There are 3 things. The first is about the property. You know by now about the deposit and the aquifer and the numbers. You know more than I knew at your age about what this land is and what's under it. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that knowledge. I expect you've already decided, or you're close. What I want to say is this. I protected this property for 25 years, not because it was valuable and not because it was mine. I protected it because of the water. The granite is a number, the water is real. People downstream don't know this property exists and don't know their wells are connected to what runs through here. That's the thing worth protecting. The thing that exists for people who will never know to be grateful for it. I hope you see it the same way. I think you do. The second is about the drawings. I should have told you when I did it. I know I should have. I kept asking myself why I didn't, and I kept coming back to the same answer, which is that I wanted you to find it yourself. I wanted you to walk in and read that building the way you read buildings, before anyone told you what to look at. I was afraid that if I told you, you'd see my interpretation rather than your own. I wanted yours. It was important to me that you arrive at the understanding through your own eyes and your own skill. Whether that was the right choice, I don't know. But it was the reason. Not pride, not manipulation. Just I believed in how you see things. I wanted that seeing to happen without my interference. The third thing is the one that took me the longest to write. I know we weren't close in the way I would have wished. I know the distance between us was mostly my making. I had reasons for it. Some of them were real reasons, and some of them were the kind of protective habits that stop being protection somewhere along the way and just become walls. I didn't know how to take them down in individual relationships while keeping them up everywhere else. I'm not offering that as an excuse, just as information about how I was built and what that cost. What I need you to know is that I was paying attention. All of it, the Mercer project. What happened with your marriage and what it cost you to get through it without saying anything to anyone. The 3 years when you took work that was well below your skill because you needed the income and you were too proud to ask for help. Which I understand because I would have done exactly the same thing. I knew. I was watching. I was tracking the shape of your life even when I wasn't in it, and I'm sorry that I didn't find a better way to be in it more directly while I had time. What I could do was build something solid and leave it for you to find. I know that's not the same as being present. I know it doesn't make up for the phone calls I didn't make, or the times I kept you at arm's length when you were trying to get closer, but it was what I knew how to do. I made things that held. It was always how I loved the people I couldn't reach. You are the right person. I've known that for longer than you've known this property existed. Not because of blood, because of how you see. Because when you find something difficult, you don't decide what it is before you've looked at it. You let it tell you. Don't look away from this one. It's worth all of it. All my love, always EA. Claire sat with the letter for a long time. She didn't try to manage it or pace it. She let it happen the way it happened. Her eyes went through the second page twice before she was sure she'd actually read it, rather than just looked at the words. Her hands were still. The room was quiet, and the building settled around her, and outside the December dark was complete. I made things that held. It was always how I loved the people I couldn't reach. She read that sentence 4 times. Because there it was. The thing she'd been circling for 3 weeks without finding the center of. The reason for the slab and the drawings and the hidden room and the 40 years of documentation. The reason Eleanor had watched from a distance and waited and built and never said a word of it out loud. This was how she loved, through construction, through making things that would outlast her ability to be present, through building the floor and trusting that the right person would eventually stand on it and understand. And here Claire was, standing on it, understanding. She wasn't going to be able to add anything to that tonight. Some things settled in their own time. She knew that from buildings, you didn't rush the cure. You let the material do what it needed to do. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases, put it with the others, the one from the desk drawer, the one from the box, the one she'd found at the back of the filing cabinet. She stacked them in order of when she'd found them. Not chronological. Found order. The order in which they'd been given to her. Which was Eleanor's order, which was the right order. She put them in the box with her name on it and set it on the shelf above the filing cabinets. She turned off the light and went to the main room and stood for a moment in the dark. Then she put on her jacket and went out to the porch. Cold, clear, the kind of December night that committed. Stars, because there were no other lights for miles, the actual stars in their actual number, which she'd stopped taking for granted after the first night here, when she'd looked up and genuinely been surprised by how many there were. She sat on the top porch step and looked at the clearing. Her building. Her 200 acres with the granite underneath and the water deeper still and the east wood behind her, with the small spring that ran because the geology required it to run, regardless of what any person decided. She sat there until she was cold enough to need to go in, and then she stayed a little longer. Because it was hers, and she was still getting used to that, and the night was clear and quiet, and there was no reason to rush. In the morning Agatha came. She didn't announce it. She never did. The truck sound in the access lane, the crunch of gravel, and then Agatha with the thermos and the early light behind her, and the particular economy of someone who didn't waste movement. She came up the porch steps careful on the board second from the top, which Claire had fixed, but Agatha hadn't registered yet, and poured 2 cups, and sat in the chair Claire had put on the porch 3 days after she arrived. The chair was old, from the barn storage she'd found on the east side. Solid. Needed a new leg brace eventually. Functioned fine for now. They sat the clearing in front of them in the early light. Long shadows from the west, the sun coming in low from the east, the tree line catching it first and the clearing brightening gradually from the east edge inward. The frozen grass. The sky, pale winter blue, committing to clear. I read the last letter, Claire said. Agatha looked at the clearing. How was it? What you'd expect, Claire said. And not what you'd expect. Agatha nodded. That was enough. They drank their coffee. A pair of juncos worked along the base of the porch rail, unhurried, finding whatever they found. One of them hopped to the bottom porch step and looked up at Claire, with the specific fearlessness of a small bird that had decided a large one was not a threat. She came out here in the mornings, Claire said. Not a question, she knew. Every time. Agatha wrapped both hands around her cup. Said the porch was the best place to decide things. Something about being outside the walls but still connected to them. Claire looked at the building behind her. Through the south-facing window, she could see the kitchen light she'd left on, the only light, square and warm in the pale morning. Inside the walls. Outside the walls. The threshold. Eleanor had understood something about that. About the value of the place in between, where you could see the structure clearly because you weren't inside it. She thought about the 1998 note. I am making this because I don't trust what happens to things when one person holds them. The trust, the record, the 40 years. She thought about what she'd written in her notebook last night. The easement and the spring and the decisions and the things still being worked out. The beginning of her own record. I found something in the first cabinet last night, Claire said. A note from 1998. Before she had anyone in mind, Agatha was quiet. She wrote that she didn't know who the right person would be, just that they'd exist. Claire looked at the clearing. 25 years between that note and me sitting in this chair. She was patient, she was. Claire turned her cup in her hands. I'm going to need to be patient too. The easement process, the core sample documentation, the state water registration, it's all long form. Nothing resolves quickly. Eleanor did nothing quickly that mattered, no. Claire looked at the east wood, the tree line on the far side of the clearing. The spring was in there somewhere, running. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. When she told you I'd come within 48 hours, did she seem sure? Or was there any uncertainty in it? Agatha thought about that. Really thought. The way she did when she wasn't going to give a quick answer. She said it the way she said things she'd already decided were facts. No hedging. A pause. But she also said, I hope she understands what she's looking at before she has to fight for it. That was the part with some weight to it. The hoping. Claire sat with that, because that was the difference, wasn't it? Certainty about the person. Hope about the circumstances. Eleanor had known Claire would come. Had believed Claire would understand. But the hoping meant she'd known the understanding wasn't guaranteed. That it would require the 3 weeks, and the folders and the cold mornings and the spring in the east wood and the letter found at the back of the oldest drawer, had required being left alone with it until it became clear. She was right to hope, Claire said, quietly. Not for effect. Agatha looked at her. Yes, she said, she was. The junco hopped off the porch step and rejoined its pair in the frozen grass. They moved together, unhurried, working the same section of ground, with the efficiency of animals that knew exactly what they were doing and didn't need to think about it. The sun cleared the east tree line fully. The clearing went bright, the frost on the grass catching the light and throwing it back. 1,000 small reflections, the field alive with it for a few minutes before the warmth started to work and the frost gave way. Claire watched it happen, and she thought, I will write this down tonight. The way the light came in, the frost and the juncos, and the spring in the east wood, and the letter in the box with her name on it. The decision about the water, the phone call with her mother, all of it. So there's a record. So the next person, whoever comes after her, in 30 years or 50, someone she can't imagine yet will have what she had. The 40 years of someone paying attention. She would be that person now. The one who watched and wrote it down and waited. Because the water was real and the land was real, and neither of them would protect themselves. And the building held. The way it was built to hold. The way everything Eleanor had put into it had been built to hold. Still standing. And now she was standing in it, ready.